Good morning, everyone, or I would rather say good afternoon. We have to use both of these greetings as we are connecting faraway places. My name is Edith Molnar. I'm the co-director of the Edith-Russ-Haus with Marcel Schwirin, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ho Tzu Nyen and David T with us. This conversation about the G for Gong, a new publication of Ho Tzu Nyen, will connect Singapore and Oldenburg. Here is the book, which will be the subject of the conversation today. The basic of the starting of the book project, which actually a joint adventure of the Sternberg Press Berlin and the Edith-Russ-Haus, was the solo show of Ho Tzu Nyen in the Edith-Russ-Haus in 2019. It was rather an ambitious project because we really wanted to have a comprehensive kind of solo presentation of nearly all of the projects of Tzu, and the biggest solo in Germany. So the exhibition displayed some of the earliest works like the Utama or the Newton, till the, at that time, recent pieces like the VR installation of the R for Resonance. Some of the critical dictionary of Southeast Asia umbrella pieces appeared as large-scale installations, like the Cloud of Unknowing and the 2-3 Tigers. And probably through this presentation, we will touch upon some of these works. But let's just introduce our nice guest today.
Yeah, and I would like first to greet Ho Tzu Nyen. He's an artist from Singapore who works in the medium of film, video, performance, and also theater. He studied creative arts at the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne and Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. His solo exhibitions include the Substation Gallery in Singapore, Art Space in Sydney, Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao, the DAAD Gallery in Berlin, the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, Hamburger Kunstverein, and Ming Contemporary Art Museum in Shanghai. And in 2011, he represented Singapore at the Venice Biennial. Tzu is also, by the way, the only artist we exhibited 3 times in the Edith-Russ-Haus since 2015. In 2015, we started with a single presentation of his video installations Earth in the Pulverturm, the powder tower of the city. In 2017, he participated with the video installation The Nameless in the group exhibition The Fevered Spectres of Art. And in 2019, with the solo survey show G for Gong.
Ho Tzu Nyen's conversation partner today will be David T. Hello. David T. is a writer, curator, and associate professor at the National University of Singapore. His curatorial projects include Returns, 12 Gwangju Biennial 2018, Misfits, Pages from a Loose Leaf Modernity, Haus der Kultur und der Welt, Berlin 2017, Transmission, Jim Thompson Art Center, Bangkok 2014, Video Vortex number 7, Yogyakarta, Indonesia 2011, and Unreal Asia, the 55th Internationale Kurzfilmtage Oberhausen in Germany 2009. David T's essays have appeared in Third Text, After All, Art Forum, and Art Margins. His book, The Thai Art Currencies of the Contemporary, was published by the MIT Press in 2017, and he was co-editor with David Morris of the Artist to Artist Independent Art Festival in Chiang Mai between 92 and 98. It was published in 2018 as part of the After All exhibition history series.
And who's not present, but also very important for the book, is the designer of the book. It's the Berlin-based artist and designer Katharina Savage. And this book is an extension of the exhibition at the Edith-Russ-Haus, so it's not a catalog, but really an artist book. And so it's not only explores Ho's distinctive artistic approach, but it also dives deeper in some of the topics of his oeuvre.
It's important to mention that Katharina was also very engaged with the selection of the images, in a sense. It's a very special book, as Marcia has just mentioned. It's not a catalog. The book itself has a very strong kind of visual narrative, how the works are also linked, and there are lots of interconnections were made, which of course Ho Tzu Nyen's oeuvre is very open to do so, hence the critical dictionary of Southeast Asia, where everything relates to everything. That's why throughout lots of conversations with Sue, we decided not to go for a classical catalogue, but it's a kind of second chapter. And we commissioned 3 fantastic authors to approach his oeuvre from different directions. Anselm Franke was invited, where he contributed the cold light of On That Time, where the tiger, which is a very important metaphorical character, or an important avatar, as David Tay is mentioning in his essay, reappears in this essay very strongly as a metaphor, one for subterranean histories. By analyzing Tzu's strategy of using CGI and other modern animation technologies, Anselm Franke addresses the artist's preoccupation with re-narrating colonial histories while digging into the political unconscious of Singapore.
And there is further a groundbreaking research text by the US-American historian Mark Opper in the book titled Agents, Analysts, and the War Against Communism in Southeast Asia. The invitation of an art historian to the book in this case goes after a peculiar topic that reoccurs in several of Tzu's work, and that stems from a kind of Cold War trauma, which is the importance of foreign agents in the politics of the region and the non-accessibility of this history. And Tzu also described the importance of working together with Mark in the book. I quote, "It is clear to me that work such as mine is only possible through the work of scholar detectives like Mark. And maybe this difference between our approaches is precisely why I found it so natural and so productive to work with him as a researcher and consultant." End of quote.
And the third essay, which was actually commissioned together with the After All, was written by David Tay under the title Under One or Several Flags. And in his words, David writes, "Southeast Asia has been Ho's most faithful companion and muse, a constant horizon of his far-reaching and peripatetic practice, a lens yielding insights into a larger Asia and a wider world that are not apparent from elsewhere. It is also precisely this regional perspective of Ho's work, which was very, very interestingly highlighted in the commissioned essay that explored in connection to the artist's practice and its complex and critical relation to the nation state." And with this small introduction, I would like to give the stage to David with a question or with an intro. You started your essay quoting Boris Groys's metaphor on the artist ruler. And I'm just wondering, I find it extremely interesting in relation to Tzu's work. And would you mind starting your intro following the argumentation of your essay? With the artist ruler?
I can try. A little bit of context, I think, will be useful for understanding this work. Not just maybe the context of what it means to be an artist in Singapore today, or what it has meant to be an artist in a place like Singapore historically, but also I think the context of, let's say, the intellectual history that also determines you know, the possibility of work like Tzu Nyen's, as we've already found. The relationship between artists and the state is something that I think has receded in some first world contexts, in maybe the Euro-American contemporary art context. Of course, nation states are still very much active players in the contemporary art universe, but I think it would be fair to say also that they are not, let's say, the chief protagonists of contemporary art, aside from in a few, let's say, marquee events where they have a very, perhaps a disproportionately strong representation, like in Venice. But actually, I think for the majority of artists that I know, like in the international contemporary art world, their relationship to the nation state is not a current preoccupation. The state's investment in contemporary art tends to be somewhat arm's length in those advanced capitalist societies. It's important, I think, for people to understand that in the Southeast Asian context, this is not the case, that the history of the relationship between modern art and the state is also very different. In the case of Singapore, and this is why I wanted to include Boris Groys in what seems to be a very sort of foreign, exotic context for him. There are many things about the relationship between contemporary art and the state in Singapore that actually means that Singapore has more in common with the Cold War socialist states in the region than it does with the ones on the so-called free world or free market side of that division. The emergence of contemporary art in this part of the world was determined very much by that division. And this extended way beyond 1989. In fact, there were some pockets of the region where the Cold War had already thawed out before 1989. And nevertheless, that division, I think, was still intact in the early part of this century. Nowadays, I think it would be fair to characterize Southeast Asia as a region functioning within a larger global contemporary art cosmos. But I think that's a very recent, it's only very recently joined that cosmos. Certainly the former socialist or still socialist parts of Southeast Asia have only really entered that circulation in the last 15 years or thereabouts. I wanted to basically out Ho Tzu Nyen as an artist who has had therefore to make his peace with the state. This is, again, something that a lot of artists in, let's say, Euro-American context maybe don't have to do, or if they do, it's maybe not a painful or difficult thing to do. Where you have, for example, independent funding streams that are administered or maybe juried by practitioners, where there's that sort of arm's length relationship between the state coffers and the deployment of state capital in the arts sector. I think an artist can approach that relationship with some comfort that they are not, in a straightforward sense, instruments of state policy. One cannot take public money anywhere in Southeast Asia with that comfort. And Singapore is perhaps peculiar in this respect, in that it is the most generously funded art community in Southeast Asia when it comes to state support. For many artists in Southeast Asia, Singapore seems to be the only country where there is genuine government support for contemporary art. And so this I think is a bit of a kind of temperature inversion if you're looking from a Western European context. This is why, for me, it was interesting to kind of bring in, Groys's reading of the Gesamtkunstwerk of Stalin, in a context where, people are not really not accustomed to, in Singapore, people are not accustomed to a kind of open critical discourse about the state's instrumentalization of art. That happens in academic circles, it happens in critical circles, it happens amongst artists, but it's not really a matter of public record for the most part. This conversation made me think of how I encountered Tzu Nyen's work in the first place. And I think the first work I ever properly saw was actually shown to me by a critic and artist by the name of Ray Langenbach, a common friend of ours. It would have been around about 2005, I guess. So before that, I was aware of Tzu Nyen's work, but I hadn't really seen it properly. And Ray Langenbach authored an essay in, I think, 2005, 2006 called Garlands of Love. And it's about, among other things, Singapore's National Day Parade, which is perhaps the most obviously Stalinist thing about Singapore's visual culture. It happens every year. It's a very large civic celebration in which a kind of display of martial power and martial prowess is very prominent. It's not that different to you know, a kind of our stereotype idea of as hard socialist kind of state celebration. And so it was important for me to kind of explore, to use this essay as an opportunity to explore that relationship that I think can be quite direct sometimes between the nation state and the artist, in ways that we have maybe fallen out of the habit of recognizing. And I should therefore perhaps dedicate the essay to Ray Langenbach for helping me to, or reminding me of that. I've characterized you, Tzu Nyen, as an artist of the state in this essay, perhaps sympathetically, but I think some complicity is, or at least duplicity is implied there. Have I been ungenerous?
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is a tough one. So, you know, and I would certainly say that the characterization is accurate in the sense that it's unavoidable, this relationship with the states, right? I think just even the first work, you know, that I properly produced, which is Utama, Every Name in History is I, which is in the exhibition at the Edith-Russ-Haus. Even that first work was entirely funded by the states, right? And this was back in 2003 when I made the work, and it's a work which had a video component as well as comes in a, actually originally it came with an installation of like 20 paintings. Back in 2003, there would have been no galleries that would show a video artwork, you know. So in order to have the exhibition, we had to do it at an independent art space at the substation, and the only source of funding, you know, that we can access is essentially state support, right? So I would say I spent quite a bit of my time as an artist filling out forms, you know, like applying for grants is pretty much part of our process of producing work. So that's kind of almost second nature. So this is just like looking at the economics, you know, behind the production of the work, right? And of course, together with application for grants, you know that comes with a certain degree of, let's say, control in terms of content. And perhaps I would say that also shapes, you know, a certain mode of speech by practitioners, right? Like, how do you kind of like negotiate or navigate this terrain, you know, to sort of, for example, to mediate state censorship in order to do what you would really want to do, or to say what you really want to say. Right? So I think that inevitably becomes part of the practice. Yeah, so in short, David, yes, I think it's a fair characterization. But I would also say that characterization is just really like the surface of it, right? Like, you know, and maybe what is more interesting and complicated is like the specific ways in which, you know, we manifest the state, either to critique it or to subvert it, or sometimes I think for me to pervert it. It's, you know, these are all, I would say, kind of like strategies that I have used so far in my practice.
I made another claim in the text about this, about the relationship between your work and the people, say. And it occurred to me that between the mythic and the generic figures that populate your works, between maybe the I and the every name in history, your characters are not real people, nor are they subjects of the nation state per se, but they have a timeless quality, or they're allegorical kind of avatars somehow. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I think, I see the characters that populate my works as ciphers. They are, as you characterized, again, quite accurately, they are for me a form of media, So they could be inhabited by forces, forces kind of like pass through them. And I would say very often I look for a certain kind of blankness in them. And, actually the first work that I made, which you have also, just mentioned, is called Utama, Every Name in History is I, right? And the phrase every name in history is I, interestingly, came out of Nietzsche's late notebooks. I think it's something that he scribbled in his notebooks. Every name in history is I. So I would also say there's this emptiness of the protagonist also allows for a certain kind of multiplicity, which at its most intense, comes close to a kind of madness, right? But it also makes me think about another book, the book by Nietzsche, which is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It actually, another title follows it, right? Which is, it's a book for everyone and no one, if I recall correctly, And I would also say this emptiness of the protagonist is also a way to open up that one single perspective that you usually attribute to a protagonist, to kind of open that up into a hopefully unruly form of multiplicity. So, and at the same time, as Nietzsche says, book for everyone or no one, right? So I think it's also at some level a kind of perhaps humility that, maybe what you are doing doesn't really resonate or speak to anyone at all. So it could be a work for no one, just as one harbors the fantasy that it could be for everyone as well, right? So I would say, the emptiness in my protagonist allows for this spectrum, right? From no one to everyone.
But that everyone is not a nationally circumscribed everyone.
No, I would say I have seldom, if ever, have I ever conceived of these possible audiences for any of my works to be circumscribed by the nations, by the boundaries of the state, right? I think, first of all, we have to see that Singapore is extremely small. So in fact, I would say that a lot of my practice comes from this, was also propelled by this desire to expand the reach of my works, right? So at the very beginning, Utama was made as a film, an installation, and it also quickly became a lecture. And it was later sort of labeled by others as a performance lecture, So the film component sort of started circulating in film festivals. The work was in sort of the arts circuit, and the lecture sort of was plugged into performing arts festivals, networks outside of Singapore, So for me, that it was always important for me, it was almost like the only justification for like spending so much time on the work is that the dissemination has to be maximized. So not just across different disciplines, but it also had to circulate outside of Singapore, because the audience, contemporary art audience of Singapore is just a very, very small number. So this has always been an issue of like necessity for me.
I'd like to come back to the transmedia dimension of your practice, maybe in a little while. But I wonder if we could tie these last couple of responses together. I mean, even if Singapore came down categorically on the so-called free world side of the Cold War divide, or at least the free market side, with regard to a Southeast Asia, let's say, that has been constituted historically, museologically, curatorially on that free world side, largely since the 1990s. I'm talking about contemporary art. Singapore has always felt like the odd one out, right? In the sense that it is rich, in the sense that it has infrastructure, museums and the like. It has more and more kind of swish, shiny gallery spaces. Would you agree that relations between artists and the state could have something to tell us regionally, or not?
Yeah, I think we have to see the state form, the form of the state in Southeast Asia as something, I would say, of a different trajectory than how it might be understood, for example, in Europe. This is simply, because of the very different trajectories of our history, right? I think through the 19th century, right? And, thinking about like artists, who are kind of like involved in plastic arts, and thinking about the state, the term that I think you used in your essay was also like about plasticity, which is interesting, right? Like, to think about plasticity is also to think of the possibility of transforming something. So I would say that, when we engage with the state, we also have the notion, perhaps it's a delusion, that we would be able at some level to transform the way the state functions. So this engagement, I would say, contrary to like my first answer about like, that the relationship with the state was predominantly one of like applying for funds and, administration. I would say that there is also a certain kind of artistic task involved, which is how we could transform how it works, right? Through our interactions with individuals who work for the state or who work with the state, right? And of course, it's also a kind of very familiar tale that very often, if one tries to change something from within, the only thing that gets changed is yourself, right? Like, and the system doesn't change. So that's, for me, an ever-present recognition that this danger is there. And I would say, engagement with the state has to be situational, it has to be strategic. One has to unplug, or to know when to unplug, just as one has to know which are the moments in which one can push through, try to push through something at least, So, Southeast Asian scholar, I think he's a scholar of Southeast Asia, I think he's Australian, it's called Tony Day, right? He wrote a book which has an interesting title, which I wanted to bring up in relation to your question, which is Fluid Iron, State Formation in Southeast Asia. So basically he describes the state as iron, which is fluid, right? So iron in the sense that you feel this, heaviness, force, but at the same time it's fluid. So there is that possibility of transforming, changing it from within. But thinking about fluid iron, I always brings to my mind the process of like casting, right? For example, bronze casting, which very nicely kind of brings us actually to the title of the book that we have, which is G for Gong. Gongs, appeared in Southeast Asia in the late Bronze Age, and they were of course made out of this process of casting, right? Like where you have something fluid, something which is liquid, which solidifies, and most of the musical instruments in Southeast Asia were either made of bamboo or gongs or bronze, I mean. And why I bring this up as well is that, in the late Bronze Age, sort of early Iron Age, when this technique of bronze casting first becomes available, it was actually quite open, as in anyone can access this technology quite easily, right? But after some time, this technology, this technique of bronze casting becomes a specialized activity, which only the elite class, and so this is like in Bronze Age, Southeast Asia, just like 2000 plus, 3000 years ago, right? So only the elite class could afford, the surplus manpower and resources you need to create bronze instruments like gongs, right? So certain archaeologists have, discovered that the emergence of bronze instruments actually came together with the emergence of state-like structures, in Southeast Asia. So the social becomes stratified, just as bronze instruments became in circulation, and this is why many sort of pre-colonial Southeast Asian royal courts, right? Their music are all sort of bronze orchestras, right? So bronze has sort of remained a kind of courtly music, So yeah, so this is, but what has been cast, sort of fixed in stone, can always be melted down and transform into something else, right? So that I would say is, still part of our, hope with engaging the systems.
The plasticity of bronze.
The plasticity of bronze, yeah. Exactly.
I mean, one could extrapolate, of course, in the direction of theatre as well. And this is another art form that you engage with a lot. We've seen in the slideshow already some images of works that we could consider theatrical, whether or not they happened in a theatre. This is also one of the great continuities, of course, in Southeast Asian contemporary culture, that it's the performing arts that have a kind of trans-historical continuity in Southeast Asia. Visual art, for those maybe not so familiar with this part of the world, visual art is a newcomer, at least in the sense of a kind of discrete two-dimensional, object is definitely a newcomer to the region. It's an object of modernity. It's an object of, frankly, of colonialism. Whereas in the performing arts, in theatre, in dance, in poetry, in music, you have actually traditions that have taken various modernities in their stride over many, many centuries. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship to those other art forms, to live arts?
Sure. Yeah, thinking about the theatrical, and also kind of relating to like the earlier strands of our conversation, right, which is about the states, right? The inevitable term that emerges is theater states. Actually, that's a term that I think Clifford Geertz, right, like the anthropologist, came up with as one of his like characterizations of sort of like polities, political power in Southeast Asia, which is, he describes this as like theater states, right? So the states for him almost performs, it's necessary for the state to kind of take on a certain performative role. And this also relates, of course, to what David mentioned earlier about Singapore's National Day Parade, which is essentially this large scale, like spectacle, like theater, right? But there's also, I think, another dimension of theater, which is interesting, which is, as it happens in Southeast Asia, which is that the theatrical forms are very often also rituals, so the ritual, they have a ritualistic dimension to them. So to kind of put it simply, sometimes one is performing, when you are performing in one of these rituals, your audiences might no longer be just humans, right? Because the proper audience of a ritual could be your ancestral spirits, gods and ghosts, right? So I think that's also, kind of like for me, a interesting thought, right? Like that we are producing works that are not solely meant for the perspective of this sort of like single individual protagonist, right? Like, if we think about Western art forms, for example, like let's say the development of the Renaissance perspective, right? Where, the picture plane anchors only this one single subject standing in front of it. So everything is laid out perspectively, according to his or her position. Right? So I think, something else happens, I would say, in a ritual. And maybe I could use an example from one of my works, which is 2 or 3 Tigers, which was shown in the exhibition G for Gong at the Edith-Russ-Haus. So 2 or 3 Tigers is a 2-channel video projection. So on one end, you have a tiger, and on the other hand, we have a actual historical figure who's a road surveyor, part of the servants of the British colony in Singapore. His name is George Dromgold Coleman. So 2 or 3 Tigers is made up of these 2 screens where the tiger and the surveyor is singing a duet, right? So they are facing each other. So when the audience enters into the artwork, a human audience can only choose one of these 2 screens to look at, because no humans, have 180-degree vision. So we can't see both the front and the back at the same time. So depending on where we turn, we either take on the perspective of the tiger, or we take on the perspective of the surveyor, right? And, so just to stretch this a little further, who then is this work made for? Like, who is able to see both screens simultaneously? And for me, it's a non-human audience who is able to see both sides simultaneously. So in this sense, for me, a work like 2 or 3 Tigers is a kind of ritual, and there's also a theater, which of course it has a theatrical dimension to it. So I guess the last point I would make about theater is that actually what interests me much more than theater is probably theatricality. So by theatricality, I mean the sense of a work being looked at, being engaged with. So for example, when we, let's say as human subjects, sometimes we feel theatrical. That's because we are behaving strangely, because we feel the gaze of other people, right? So this awareness of being looked at, this is what I kind of like connect with the theatrical, So I would say in that sense, almost all of my works are theatrical. They are made in relation to this subject, or made in relation to a questioning of who this subject is. And I would say very often that the struggle is to sort of expand beyond this subject as discrete individual protagonists, which, for example, I would say almost all films, right, like fiction films, have this same structure, which is that they all have one protagonist, and the entire story follows this one protagonist, right? Which is also, I would say, a model of realist novels, European realist models of the novel from the 19th century, and which is for me, something that we need to loosen or break out of.
Given that you,
can
sorry.
I just add something, because
Sure.
I just want to jump in when so you mentioned theatricality, which is so important for you. I also find it extremely interesting how you could also involve the theatricality even in another installation, like when you have the video installation of the name, for instance. We had incredible challenges to put it into action because you wanted to involve objects which were represented in the same space where the video was. So we had to make a very theatrical kind of technical solutions that in every end of the screening of the name, for instance, a vitrine had to be lit up where people actually could see the publications being on display. And that was the moment now, and I really got an understanding of how this moment of theatricality you could even smuggle into a much more simple kind of setting of a video installation. But in relation to this line of thought, I would like to also ask something in relation to how comfortably you are moving in between different moving image genres, because I was always been fascinated by this strategy, artistic strategy you have. And I think David put it into an incredibly interesting way, put it into words, how you relate to media when he says, of course, it's just a little quote from a much broader context when he elaborates on the cosmotext techniques, but he also says that whose intermediality is non-linear, always sustaining the possibility of reversal. Its movement is not dialectical, but more like a diabolical involution. And how, when you read this, how you could relate to this kind of, I think, pretty brilliant formulation of his in the essay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think, yeah, this kind of like, I guess, slipperiness, between genres. Yeah, to be honest, I can no longer tell how much of it was something I deliberately set out to do, or it was just kind of like something that also happened along the way. But I think that for sure, it very much connects to that question of like, who is watching this work, right? Like, and also the question of the protagonist, what we had discussed earlier about it being everyone and no one. So this same slipperiness that I ask for, in the audience, I would say is also manifested in the way that I work, right? And it's interesting sometimes for me to take the same subject matter, but to kind of plug it into different fields. So for example, the triple agents, who was the leader of the Malayan Communist Party from 1939 to 1947, Laitik, was the subject of a found footage video that I made called The Nameless, which we also showed. But he's also the subject of a theatrical piece that I made, which was called The Mysterious Lytic, in which I use a robot to embody this triple agent. Right? So it's also interesting for me to take the same subject matter with my own sort of like hypothesis or reading of this subject matter, and to kind of insert it into like two, different forms, to see how the media itself, the difference in the media itself, could transform the subject matter. So I would say that by now, I no longer think about my works in relation to like medias or discipline, but they have become, something that sort of like floats or is suspended between these, different forms and different genres.
Let me pick up on that, if I may. In this conversation we've already had, I just want to recall two moments. One where you're saying that the people in your works are media, right? You see them as media, not as people. At least not as people in, let's say, a kind of socio-political sense of the word. You are also saying that you are constantly striving to unsettle or unseat the idea of a unitary subject position, which might be represented in an image, might also be sort of implied on the part of a viewer or audience. So I want to return actually to the essay, because in the essay I've cast media as protagonists, right? So we're getting a little bit circular here, but I've cast the media themselves as the protagonists, as a way to try to understand your work historically, or at least to try to understand the kind of history that is being channeled in your work. I'm trying to account for the fact that, as we've discovered, there is this kind of slipperiness between the one and the many, the individual and the social, the I and the every name in history, but also for the fact that in sort of denying the possibility of, or denying the privilege of, authoritative official history as, let's say, the destination of historical inquiry, you end up beyond states, right? You end up beyond nation states, either before them in some cases, maybe secreted within them, moving frictionlessly between them. And the where might as well be called Southeast Asia. But if anything belongs, historically speaking, to that terrain, it's the media. Would you say that that is too speculative an understanding of what's going on?
Yeah, could you elaborate more? Like, the last statement that you made.
Yeah, I get the sense that insofar as your people are not protagonists in the way that I've described, there is nevertheless a place. Your work nevertheless happens in a place. And this, I think, it feels to me that this is the same place in Two or Three Tigers as it was in the case of Utama all those years ago, right? I want to know what I should call that place. And it seemed to me, in putting the essay together, that place was Southeast Asia. I'm well conscious of the hazards of let's say glossing that position as a region and the geopolitical baggage that comes with that phrase. But nevertheless, it seems to me that this is what we come back to, that this is the subject position, and that if these media / protagonists belong anywhere, it's Southeast Asia. The interplay that's happening between different art forms, between different media, and between different narratives in your work would not make the same sense in Europe. It doesn't make the same sense in South America. You see what I'm getting at? I wonder whether that's a guide, that should be a guide to the geography of your work.
Yeah, thank you. I think that pulls out a few, like, strands of thought, which are kind of like important to how I think about my own practice. Right? I think, yeah, I think definitely, you know, I think it's a good question to ask, like, you know, to formulate, like, in terms of like where or what is this place. And Southeast Asia, I would say, is as good as any as a possible answer, simply because Southeast Asia in itself is a place / non-place, you know, at the same time, right? So what I mean is, you know, the term Southeast Asia, for example, it never existed within the region. Let's say prior to the Second World War, nobody from the region thinks of themselves as being Southeast Asians, right? So the term Southeast Asia really started circulating at the close of the Second World War, with the creation of the Southeast Asian Command by the Allied forces. Right? So for me, you know, this notion of Southeast Asia is something totally constructed. But of course, after half a century, it has also taken on its own sort of like historical weight. So it's an object that is both real and unreal at the same time, you know. And I would say that is its fascination for me. So it is, you know, we could also say that it is both a place and also a kind of like non-place, right? And if we look at Southeast Asia from a sort of like different trajectory, it is also for me very much a kind of mediating sort of buffer. So it's important to you know, move out of the state so that you know, our sort of perspective is not confined to the borders, you know, to these arbitrary borders, which is our states. But at the same time, I didn't want to take on this perspective, which was global, right? Like, you know, so you had the local, which is your, you know, my nation state, for example, Singapore, and the opposite end of that, you know, possibly could be the global. So for me, choosing the regional, you know, is kind of this mid-place between these two poles. And for me, that kind of like allows me certain kind of like mobility of movement between these two ends, right? So that was also something that interested me in thinking of Southeast Asia, like, you know, as a place. Finally, you know, I think as a kind of third possible proposition, what is this place? I would say this place could be nothing, you know, could be not nothing, but nothingness, right? And, you know, in the last few years, I have done quite a number of projects and engaging with a group of Japanese philosophers from the sort of, who are, you know, active from the 1920s and the 30s. They are called the Kyoto School. So the founder of the Kyoto School is a philosopher called Nishida Kitaro. And, you know, he has this, so one of his most important kind of like foundational concepts is what he calls Zettai Mu, which is Japanese for absolute nothingness, you know. And his philosophy eventually develops. So he kind of deepened this concept by calling it a place, right? A topos, a place of nothingness, you know. And this place of nothingness for him is kind of the root of Eastern philosophical systems, you know, which for him is based on nothingness, as, let's say, compared to Western philosophical systems, which to him are all systems of being, right? So for him, sort of Asian systems are systems of non-being, you know. So I would say that there is something of these concepts which, you know, I have been interested in. I mean, been looking into both the abuse of these concepts, but also its sort of like possible potential, right? Because, as any good Taoist would tell you, like emptiness is first needed before something can move, right? Before something can change, right? If, for example, if there's no empty spaces between our bones, like in our joints, we will not be capable of movement, right? So I would say this emptiness is also, for me, the possibility of transformation, of metamorphosis, which I think is something quite crucial to quite a number of my works as well.
It's fraught territory, Japanese philosophy of the 1930s. I understand you're also working in those projects with researchers who are, let's say, in a kind of scholarly way, really digging in archives and so on. I wanted to maybe turn to the role of research in your practice and maybe ask a little bit about how you see your way of working as having changed or perhaps not. Your earliest works were clearly informed by research, both we could call it artistic research, but also some scholarly sources, and indeed on many of the same issues and histories that I think have been preoccupations of your practice ever since. But with the critical dictionary, it seems to me research has become manifest as pretext and maybe as context for the work in a way that it wasn't before. How has its place in your practice changed, do you think?
Yeah, actually, I would say as far as I can think back, right? Like I have always sort of spent much more time like kind of researching the subject than making the work. And this has been true for almost like all of my works, right? I would say the work is almost produced only because of a deadline, which forces me to truncate like the process of researching. And the work always becomes for me that moment in which all of these research along of, with all of the possible insights I might have gained from them, all my questions and all my doubts. For me, the work is a way to kind of compress all of these into something formal, something which could be felt at a different register from these original source materials that might have inspired me. So for me, the work of arts or the project is always just this kind of like condensation, at the end. An analogy that I sometimes think about is like formation of rocks, which after eons of movement in the earth, the forces come together, compress, and shape a rock. Right? So for me, the works that I produce come out of these, processes, right, of compression and condensation. And I would say, over the course of my practice, my relationship to research has of course changed, partly due to shifts in my focus and also possibly an expansion of my means. For the most part of my career, I was like the only researcher who was working on the project, and this was because of necessity, right? And of late, it's become much more possible for me to engage with other professionals. So the means definitely facilitated a certain sort of like expansion of how I've worked with research. but at the same time, my interest has also gone into areas which are, I would say, outside my field of comfort, right? So for example, dealing with the very fraught histories of Japan, as you put it, from during the Second World War, dealing with materials that are only in Japanese, dealing even with these materials in Japanese that most of my Japanese peers don't even want to really touch, right? Like, so this is when it becomes absolutely necessary for me to sort of work also with like local researchers, right? And this process of exchange with my researchers, in a way for me, it probably comes very close to what in theater you would call a dramaturgical process. So I would say, like, you know, in the German sort of like system of the theater, you always have sort of like the figure of the dramaturg, who is not just interested in research, but also is able to kind of like enter into a conversation, you know, with the director, for example, right? So for me, I have tried to engage all my researchers in the same way. So maybe thinking of them also as like the first possible audience of the work that I'm making, you know. So, and at the same time, I think this engagement with all of these researchers has also loosened up this sort of like perspective, right? Like this single perspective that I'm always trying to deconstruct or to multiply or to question. So just by the very acts of working with researchers who come with their own perspectives, who come with their own biases, maybe already forces me out of my skin.
And perhaps that's why for us also was so important through the editing process that you made this very radical decision to emphasize the importance of research in your own work, to invite a historian, Mark Opper, who actually was commissioned to write this very, very groundbreaking research paper, which we publish in the book.
Yes, exactly. So like with Mark Opper, who's kind of, you know, really a very kind of sort of classical mode of historian, and I would say it's a historian of the detective mode. You know, he's someone who digs for like primary information, who deals with like you know, who's hunting down facts, right? And working with him was highly interesting because he also became involved in the artistic processes that I was involved with in making the theatrical play, for example, The Mysterious Lytic, in which Mark Opper was a researcher, a sort of slash dramaturg, you know. So he was giving me comments and feedback as well on the scripting. So I think these kinds of exchanges not only take me out of my comfort zone, like out of my skin, but hopefully it also allows Mark Opper to sort of slip out of his usual kind of like positions and his usual processes to engage in something different.
I think one of the fascinations of your work also is that this shaky position of Southeast Asia as its identity, what is so important in your work and what David put so precisely, is also something like a role model, what happens now to the whole world. So this idea of that we have an identity that is somehow based in a certain kind of history, that usually with a lot of violence, sometimes intellectual violence, sometimes physical violence, is pressed into one narration. This is fading. And somehow I have the feeling we won't come back to it. And I always had the feeling, seeing your work from European and German perspective, this is part of the fascination that people have looking at your work. It's somehow not looking into the past, but it's more looking into the future of uncertain identities and different narrations that even with a huge intellectual effort, we cannot put together again. And I also like very much, David, that you started your talk this afternoon mentioning Ray Langenbach, because this is also the way how we met Sue, indirectly through Ray Langenbach, who invited in the 90s to a festival in the German countryside, the Worklife-Biennial, and later I found his name in the credits of one of your films, Sue, and this is how we came in contact through Ray directly. And Ray left also the States because he couldn't cope with the way how the States were acting in the world. So he has the relation that was so important for you between the artist and the state was very shaky for Ray Langenbach, and he went into a different state to explore more of that. But to put it in a question, Sue, I would wonder how you feel about the reception of your work in Southeast Asia and, for example, in the United States or in Europe. Is this very different? Beside the fact that, of course, Europeans always have to learn a little bit about the history to understand the full picture. But is there a principal difference, or would you say it's very similar?
Yeah, that's a tough one, like about reception. Of course, it's something I wonder about, but I'm not sure if I really came to any sort of fixed and solid conclusions, but what I can say is that even if my work has as its subject matter Southeast Asia, I would say a lot of the concepts that I employed and borrowed also did not originate simply from Southeast Asia. Right? So, for example, I would say the French philosopher Deleuze, he's a sort of a kind of a big part, I would say, of how I think and work. And, so this has also been kind of folded, into sort of Southeast Asian subject matters within the dictionary. And I would say this choice for me is deliberate, that thinking about Southeast Asia also is the thought of the outside, right? Like what is outside Southeast Asia? So I would say Southeast Asia is almost for me this a certain kind of like membrane, so there could be a possible insight if there could be an outside, and the membrane is there where the inside and the outside is in this process of exchange, So as opposed maybe to earlier generation of like Southeast Asianists who very much believe in like autonomy and who might, sort of reject sort of Western ideas, Western epistemologies, discourses, to look for something that is kind of like authentically Southeast Asian. I would say my strategy has always been quite different from that. Like for me, it's always a continuous kind of exchange between the inside and the outside. So I would say there might be elements in my work, perhaps that could be understood better within a European context, just as I'm sure there are many aspects of it that could be felt or understood much better, like within Southeast Asia itself. But another way of putting it is that my work could be equally strange to both like Southeast Asians or Europeans. So it's for me this process of the reception is still something I'm curious and still like something I'm thinking about. But as for your earlier points, thinking about this, discomfort with like the state, right? Kind of going back also to this question of the state. I guess one really important thing to speak about, like in relation to Singapore, is that Singapore is very small. It takes like an hour to drive from one end of Singapore to the other end, right? Like, which is also to say that Singapore has no hinterland. There is nowhere for one to get out, right? Like to escape. We are just a highly compressed, a very condensed state, right? So there might be no physical space in which one can unplug. But at the same time, if one needs to escape or take flight from the state, you have to find other means, other strategies of doing that. And, and I would say that, a lot of the strategies kind of like employed in my work and my practice is also born out of this sort of attempt to escape the state without physically moving, right? So how can I engage with it, by staying in place, if I did not have the means of like leaving, right, this, my country, let's to say.
So you're well prepared, in other words, for the current predicament.
Yes. In what sense?
The COVID immobility.
Immobility, yes. But it's also different when one takes on immobility as a choice and when one is forced to be immobile as we are now. So I would also say that the last year and a half has been a different kind of experience for me. But I would also think that this traveling without possibly moving, is something as a mode of thought, is something quite important for me. This ability to kind of move without necessarily physically traveling, and I would say much of my works were kind of attempts at doing this. Right? I guess, the other thing which Marcel's comments sort of made me think about is this question of like uncertainty, and I would say like fact and fiction, right? Like, that today we seem to have lost faith in facts, right? It's everything is kind of reduced to versions of fiction. The states produce fictions sometimes to distract us from other fictions, and I think this is something quite crucial for me, this production of like fictions and how to produce fictions that can be models. So it is not just fictions as a simple story, but that within the fiction, the fiction itself seems to be a kind of model, or it seems to promise some kind of strategies which we can use for navigating this uncertainty.
It's a very nice closing thought.
Indeed it is.
And thank you very much. It was a wonderful conversation, and we are very happy to present the book to the world with this conversation.
In all this COVID misery, it's very nice that we could make this conversation, and maybe would not have done it because it was only possible virtually. We wouldn't have done it like this if not for COVID. So sometimes also very bad things have some positive side effects. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you,
everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.